This video is from Dick Schwartz's presentation in Toronto in 2017.
In this video he describes his journey from family systems work to the internal work. He describes how protective parts get into extreme roles and defines burdens and how unburdening transforms the system. He describes legacy burdens and how they get taken on. He offers a critique of attachment theory, explains why therapists are not necessary as attachment figures for clients, and talks about how self is comparable to the good parent. He critiques traditional EMDR from an IFS perspective and discusses the roles parts typically take after unburdening and how burdens differ from vulnerability. He describes how his discovery of the self challenged his scientific atheistic worldview and led to the incorporation of the spiritual dimension of the model. He also explains how mindfulness is different from the self-to-part connection. He describes aspects of self beyond the 8 C's that are usually talked about, and addresses why some clients have greater difficulty accessing self. And finally, he speaks to how self may be invited into the system with DID clients. Enjoy.
Okay, so an exciting time to be in the trauma field. The practitioners at the leading edge are all referencing internal family systems as the model to be working with. Bessel van der Kolk comments that for him, discovering internal family systems was a breakthrough, and he believes it will change the way therapy is practiced. Janina Fisher, those of you familiar with Janina, her model is rooted in internal family systems. And recently, the results from the phase 2 study using MDMA-assisted psychotherapy for people with chronic PTSD showed that, quote, study participants have spontaneously brought up their awareness of different parts of themselves in 81% of the sessions. Michael Mithofer, who heads up that study, states, in our experience, MDMA in a therapeutic setting often raises awareness of different parts of the psyche and simultaneously brings forth more self-energy to allow exploration of the parts with greater compassion and clarity. So in other words, what's emerging from this study is validating this model as a model of being and healing. Long-term PTSD survivors showed 83% who had experienced sexual abuse no longer met the PTSD criteria after 2 sessions of working with the MDMA. How many times have you heard, oh, you just need to love yourself more? Anybody ever heard that or heard anybody say that? Yeah, okay. Well, with no methodology, that just becomes another should. It's a should from a well-intentioned part. I should love myself more, but it's a should. What the internal family systems model enables us to do is enable us to access our compassion for ourselves, or more accurately for our parts, and enables us to facilitate that process for our clients in order for them to be able to take responsibility for their own healing. Dick Schwartz often describes the internal family systems therapist as a hope merchant. The hope that this method and model offers is evidence-based. I'm delighted to introduce my friend, my mentor, a master therapist and a man I believe to be a force for good on this earth at this time when we need it, Dick Schwartz.
Hi. So I want to thank Derek for that very sweet intro. He didn't mention this, but he's made big contributions to IFS himself. He does an amazing workshop on IFS with grief and wrote a chapter on that for a recent book, and is also a great guy. So I'm very honored to have you bring me here. It's great to be here. I think I've not been to Toronto since I was a hippie, so it's great to be back. I always loved the city. And who knew there was such interest in IFS in Canada, so I'm really glad about that too. Thank you for coming. So I'm going to introduce the model, and as I do that, apply it to trauma. How many are multiple personalities? I don't mean how many of you have multiple personality disorder, but how many of you have never had this experience? You're in an intimate relationship, you get into conflict, you find yourself doing and saying things you know are making it worse, and you can't stop yourself. Anybody never have that experience?
Oh, never. Sorry.
How about in the last week, anybody had that experience? So, my contention is that if you were to focus on that temper of yours and ask it some questions inside, you would learn that it's not just a bundle of anger, but in fact, it has pain, it has fear, and it has a lot to tell you about itself. And it is what I call a part of you. It's very different from a bunch of other parts. And it's possible to form a new kind of relationship with it. So that's basically what I mean. We're all multiple personalities in that sense. And it's actually a really good thing to be a multiple personality, because it turns out they all have wonderful qualities to lend to us. So I'm going to go into a story of how I came to that conclusion initially, because like most of you, I always thought there was just this one mind in there, and it had different thoughts and emotions that emanated from it, but we were really just one person, and those crazy multiples were the ones with the alters. And my position now is that what are called alters in those people are no different from what I'm calling parts, except that their system got blown apart by the horrific trauma they suffered as children, such that theirs are very compartmentalized. But we all have these full range subpersonalities. So I'm going to go back 35 years, I think it is about 35 years now, and I'm a fresh graduate from a doctoral program in marital and family therapy, and I think family therapy is the shit. You know, family therapy is going to take over the world and change everything, because unlike those silly individual psychodynamic therapists that mucked around in this inner world, we could change everything in there by simply reorganizing these external relationships. Some of you are probably old enough to remember those days where there was a big polarization when family therapy just emerged onto the scene. And we thought we'd found the Holy Grail. And I held that belief until I made the mistake, which I hope you never do, of testing your most basic assumptions. And I gathered together a group of 30 bulimic kids. Bulimia had just emerged on the scene back then, too. This is about 1982. And with my colleague Mary Jo Barrett, some of you might know that name, we did an outcome study of our structural strategic family therapy. And I found that I could change the families just the way the book said to do it, but my clients didn't realize they'd been cured. And they kept binging and purging on me. And so out of frustration, I took this leap. For family therapists, it was a big betrayal of asking what was happening inside of them that was having this happen. And they started talking this language of parts. And they would say, you know, when something bad happens in my life, it triggers this critic who's calling me really brutal names, but then that brings up this part that feels so ashamed and young and empty and alone. And that feeling is so dreadful that to the rescue comes the binge and takes me away. But the act of the binge brings back the critic who's now calling me a pig on top of the other names. And then that brings back that young, empty, worthless feeling. And so the binge has to come back. And my clients would be in that kind of vicious, escalating cycle all day. And it sounded familiar to me. It sounded like sequences of interaction among family members. that I'd been studying in families. So I got curious about it. At first I got scared because they were talking about these parts as if they had a lot of autonomy and as if they could totally dominate them and take over. And I thought, maybe these people are a lot sicker than I thought, until I started listening inside myself and, oh my God, I've got them too. And some of mine are as extreme as theirs about food. And that's when I got curious about it. And was lucky to have a couple clients who could be very articulate about their inner worlds and sort of taught this to me. And they would talk about a part, like I said, the critic or these other parts, but I was back then assuming that these things were what most of the field was assuming, which is the critic was a kind of internalized parental energy or voice, and the binge was an out-of-control impulse. And when you think of these things that way, you're very limited in how you have your client relate to them. Basically, I was trying to get my client to stand up for herself. So I was trying to get my client to stand up against the critic instead of just being passively taking it, and to control the binge. And clients would come back saying, things are getting worse. The critic's more extreme now, I'm binging more than ever. But I was like the man in a hole with a shovel. I'd say, dig deeper. I would say, stand up more or control more. Until the first client I was aware of with this extensive sex abuse history, who also cut herself on her wrists and insisted on showing me the open wounds every session. And by then, I'd learned about Gestalt therapy open chair, empty chair technique. Do you know about this? So I could have a client sit in one chair and imagine that a part of her was in the other chair, and then move into the other chair and be that part. And you could observe these dialogues. And I was hearing about 4 and 5 parts, so I'd have 5 chairs in my office and clients are hopping all over. So I'm trying to talk to this cutting part, and one session I just decided I can't stand for her to keep doing this on my watch. So for a couple hours I badgered this cutting part and had her badger it. And finally at the end of the session it said, okay, I won't cut her this week. And of course I opened the door to the next session and she's got a big gash down the side of her face. And I collapsed and spontaneously said, I give up. I can't beat you with this. And the part said, I don't really want to beat you. And that was a pivotal moment in the history of this model because I shifted from being kind of coercive to just being curious. And I said, why do you do this to her then? And the part proceeded to tell me how when she was being abused, it needed to get her out of her body and it needed to contain the rage that would get her more abuse. And I shifted again. Now I'm not just curious about it, but I have a kind of appreciation for the heroic role it played in her life. And I can extend that to the part and have her extend that to the part. And the part burst into tears because everyone had demonized it and tried to get rid of it. And talked more about why it still needed to do this, even though she wasn't a kid anymore. Who talked about very vulnerable parts it was still protecting, the rage was still there, had to control. But as she was talking, as this part was talking, it sounded like it wasn't living in the present, like it was still stuck back in those trauma scenes. And with all of that, I began to shift my view of these parts. Family therapy's big contribution was that you can't take a kid out of a family and just say no, just tell them to stop doing this. That you have to understand the network of relationships that are maintaining that behavior and do something about all of that. Occurred to me, maybe the same thing's true with these internal parts. Maybe this part can't change until a bunch of other things have changed. like it's no longer stuck in the past, and like it doesn't have to protect these younger ones, and it doesn't have to hold off the rage, and so on. And maybe then it could change. And actually, that's what they started talking about, these parts. So, with all of that, it occurred to me, maybe they are like kids in a family who are forced out of their naturally delightful states into roles by the dynamics in the family or by what's happened to the family. And indeed, that's the way I understand them now. So, that question earlier, how many of you are multiple personalities? Next time I come, I hope everybody raises their hand, because we're all multiple personalities, and that's great. That's a really good thing, because one mind couldn't do everything we have to do simultaneously. So we're born, from my point of view, with this capacity. It's the nature of the mind to be multiple and to have these discrete personalities who can work on different aspects of a problem simultaneously and lend lots of specialized talents and emotions to us in their naturally valuable states. But again, particularly trauma or attachment injuries, force them out of those roles, those states, into extremes that can be very damaging, that maybe were needed when the trauma was happening, but the continuation of them can be screwing up your life. So that's the first assumption of IFS. I'm sort of the Will Rogers of the phenomenon. I've never met a part that ultimately I didn't like. And I've used this work with murderers, with child molesters, with all kinds of heinous type parts. And I'm here to tell you that once approached from this curious place, they will share their secret histories of how they were forced into whatever role they're in, and how the burdens they carry are driving the way they operate. So this concept of burdens is crucial, so I'm going to quickly define it. A burden is an extreme belief or emotion that came into your system either from your direct experience in your life or that you inherited somehow through your family lineage, through your ethnic group, through our culture, and attached to these parts, almost like a virus does to an app, and then drives the operation of the part thereafter. So parts are in their extreme, in extremis, because they're stuck in the past, because they have to protect other parts, and because they carry these burdens. And our field has made the mistake of assuming the part is the burden it carries. So this is a big concept. This is a big revolutionary idea that parts are not what they carry, and that they actually can transform once they unburden into their naturally valuable states. They're actually naturally quite valuable. Okay, so this is a basic concept and is quite different than most of the rest of the field. So I'm happy to entertain questions or comments. Yeah.
You included energies coming in as possible sources of burdens. Could you say more about what you mean by energies coming in?
Yeah, so like a critic, for example, as you get to know it, and you ask, what is it you carry? They'll often say, I carry my mother's energy. So it's sort of not just an emotion or belief, it's sort of an embodiment of the mother. And in more psychodynamic systems, this would be called an introject. But as I say, the field has mistaken the introject for the whole part. And when you think of them that way, you either ignore them or you fight with them. And again, the more you fight with them, the stronger they get by and large. So Anything else? Okay, I'm going to assume you're buying this then. Yes.
I was just wondering if you can say a little bit more about how legacy burdens may get passed on.
So how do you accrue legacy burdens? So a variety of ways. You know, there's this whole new field of, words escaping me at the moment, epigenetics, where they're actually showing your genes actually change. So they've done it with, I guess, rats, where they'll shock one generation of rats, and then their offspring have shock reactions, even though they've never been shocked. So that's one way. But also, kids have a way of taking on parents' energy for various reasons. Sometimes to try to protect the parent or help them out, sometimes because they think if they act, the part thinks if it acts like your parent and criticizes you the way the parent does, you'll behave. So there's a variety of ways that this happens. Just to make it in our culture, we have to absorb, I don't know about the Canadian culture, but in the US, all kinds of crazy burdens about the world and people and how to make it in life. And, you know, I've been unburdening that for 10 years now, all those legacy burdens we get from our culture. The question is, this self, I haven't gotten to self yet, but the self that I'm about to talk about. Yeah, she intuited, because you're intuitive. Is that comparable to what attachment theory talks about in terms of a good parent? And yes, in fact, I've come to talk about IFS as attachment theory taken inside. So rather than the therapist or a spouse or some other person, external person, becoming the good attachment figure for your client, the self, their self becomes that good attachment figure, which is also a huge, huge shift in the way you do therapy. I presented a few weeks ago at Bessel van der Kolk's trauma conference, which is just most everybody's into attachment theory. And I said, at least in this perspective, attachment theory got it wrong. Because there is this assumption among attachment-based therapies that it has to come through a relationship with an external person. And it's just not true. So, yes, sir.
So I'm just trying to wrap my head around the idea that the burden is not the part. So how would I, if a part is very critical and it would to put down its burden, what would the characteristics of an unburdened part be without that a critic part?
Yeah, it's a great question. So I tend to try not to make big generalizations about that because I love for people to discover. But often parts, when they're unburdened, become the opposite of what they've been. So your critic becomes your cheerleader. The part that tries to get you to withdraw tries to help you get out in the world, so on and so on. They become advisors rather than dominators, so on. Yeah. You've used vulnerability as a synonym for burden in the past. Yes, but a burden is something you can actually expel from the system. That's true. That's what we do. Yeah. Yes. Is a burden the only thing a part carries? Yes. Okay, so this is all very cool, and as I started to get this from parts, I'm a relationship therapist, I'm a systems guy, so I'm trying to get my clients to improve their relationship with these critics or these other parts. So I'm having these dialogues sometime in the beginning in the open chair stuff, and then I had a client who said, "You don't really have to do that. I can just sit here and do it." And so now most people just sit there and do it. And so let's say I'm working with one of these bulimic kids, trying to improve her relationship with the critic. So I'm having them have a dialogue, and in the middle of the dialogue, she gets furious with the critic. And it reminded me of family sessions where I'm trying to have maybe a teenage kid talk to her critical mother and improve their relationship, and she gets angry at the mother, and we were taught as structural family therapists to look around the room and see if somebody isn't siding, even covertly, with the daughter against the mother. And you find the father's doing that, you get him to step back in the room, and now things go better between the mother and the daughter. So basic boundary making technique. Thinking maybe the same thing's happening with this inner system. Maybe as my client's trying to get along with this critic, some part who hates the critic is coming and is doing the talking. So I began asking clients, could you find the one who just said that and ask it to step back in there? Same intervention I use with families, basically. And to my utter amazement, this client would say, okay, it did. And I'd say, okay, now how do you feel toward the critic? And it would be an entirely different answer. Different tone of voice, different facial expression, and something like, now I'm just kind of curious about why it's calling me names. Seconds earlier, they hated it, or were terrified of it, or some other extreme feeling. But just by getting those other parts to give more space to the client, seemed to release this other person in there who, in addition to being curious, would suddenly be calm, suddenly be confident relative to the part, and often immediately compassionate, whereas seconds earlier they hated it. Blew my mind. And when I asked, now what part of you is that, because we want to keep that around, they'd say some version of, that's not a part like these others, that's more me or myself. So I came to call that the self with a capital S. And I would do it with other clients. And suddenly it was like the same person popped up with the same qualities. And in addition to some of those C-word qualities I just mentioned, would also have a kind of wisdom about how to relate to these parts in a healing way, and would take over the session. And I would just get out of the way. And again, it was blowing my mind because I had been taught, like you, from basic attachment theory, that for somebody to have that kind of ego strength, they had to have had a certain kind of parenting during a critical period in their life, in their childhood, and if they didn't get that, they were out of luck until they got it from some external relationship. And here it was. So how do you explain that? So I tried a variety of sort of science-based explanations because at the time I was very aspiritual. I was actually come from this very scientific family. So I was a kind of scientific atheist type. And the more I would stay with the self, even with clients that had horrific childhoods, there was no way you could find somebody in their childhood who could account for this being there. I had to stop with science and actually look towards spirituality for any kind of place to ground these observations. And so now I actually believe this is what all the spiritual traditions know about. Virtually no psychotherapies know about it, but virtually every spiritual tradition knows about it, has a word for it. And I just completed a book that should be out in maybe 3 months, where one section of the book we scanned all the spiritual traditions and looked at what I'm calling self from these different perspectives. And it was an amazing experience because they all know what I'm talking about. So that's what we're calling self, and that does indeed become the good internal parent, the good attachment figure for these parts, which doesn't mean therapists are obsolete and aren't necessary, but they're not necessary in the same way of being the attachment figure for your client. So 35 years later, having worked with thousands of clients, many of whom I specialize in the treatment of severe complex trauma for 20 years with this model. So, thousands of therapists doing this around the country now or around the world. We can safely say that this self is in everybody. It's your birthright. You come into the world with it also. It's just beneath the surface of these parts. When they open space, it emerges spontaneously. You don't have to build it up. You don't have to practice the muscle of compassion. I've had many debates with Buddhists about these issues. It's just there. And in addition to those 4 C words that I mentioned already, curiosity, calm, confidence, compassion, it manifests in general with 4 more, at least at different points. Creativity in how the client relates to parts or to people. Clarity. So when you access self, the actual image of the part changes. What looked initially like a monster now looks like a teenage kid in the client's imagery. Courage. Clients who were terrified of opening doors or abysses or basements inside now can go. And connectedness. Connectedness in the sense of feeling connected to humanity, feeling like you belong, and connected in the sense of much more empathy for other people, and then also a desire to connect, the desire to connect to parts, a desire to connect to people. So those are what we call the 8 C's of self-leadership. There are others that also manifest. We didn't include them partly because they don't begin with the letter C, because I like alliteration, but also they aren't quite as relevant to the healing process, but things like forgiveness and perspective and joy and sense of well-being and so on. So this is even more radical than the idea that we're all multiple personalities. And so I'll pause here and just see if there are any questions or reactions. I am saying that, yes. I'm saying the self manifests, doesn't need to develop those and others, yes. Do some clients have more difficulty accessing self than others? Absolutely. Not because it's not there or even that it's even buried deeper. It's because their parts have less trust that it's safe to let it come out. And so it takes longer to convince them to open space for it. That's really the only reason. Yeah. But once they do, and I've done this with clients that were diagnosed DID, where self doesn't seem to be around at all, and all you've got is parts, and you become the self to the system for a while. But at some point, if they trust me enough and I ask, would you be willing to step back? And they do it, it's the same damn self that shows up. And then I hand the baton to the self, and the self starts to take over, and there's a kind of shitstorm because all the parts are attached to me, and who is this person you're handing the baton to? So we weather that, and yeah. So the question is, if a client's doing some kind of contemplative practice to cultivate these qualities, what's that about then? So, and again, I've had many debates with various traditions and with His Holiness the Dalai Lama, actually, several months ago. And some people, when they meditate, are using it as what's been called a spiritual bypass. Their parts are getting them away from their pain through the meditation. Some people, when they meditate, and in particular mindfulness meditation of various kinds, it's sort of like a practice. When you do a mindfulness meditation, you're noticing your thoughts and emotions, but you're not in them. And you're feeling accepting of them. Does that sound right? So your parts are seeing that it's safe to let you, yourself, separate a little bit, and that nothing bad happens. In fact, your life goes better. And that's a good practice. And so I've got nothing against it. That's a good practice. And a lot of my clients do it if they're doing it for that reason. But the way it's come into psychotherapy, mindfulness, and other ways, for me, it's just a good first step, because if you're thinking these things are ephemeral thoughts and emotions, it makes sense to just observe them. But if you think of them as suffering beings, it's not compassionate to just passively witness them parade by. Does that make sense? Who's doing the practice? Is it a part trying to do it to regulate your anxiety and get you away from it? Or like, again,
Parts can do good things too, though, right?
oh yeah. All parts are good. It's just when they're trying to get you away from other parts that's a problem. So I alluded to the fact that I was a hippie, and I got into TM back in the day, and I was totally using it as a spiritual bypass for a period of time. And it also gave me some feeling of what self is like, that I was able to then carry into my work with clients and recognize it when I experienced it. So, yeah.
Sorry, I might not know that reference. You said TM.
Transcendental meditation. Yeah, you're too young. Yeah. So, how do you compare IFS with EMDR? First of all, most EMDR teachers don't believe in parts per se. Second, I'm going to use this as a segue into the next piece I'm going to teach. So, my problem with EMDR, and I've been banging on this drum for a long time with the field, is that this can bypass what I call protective parts and get to what I call exiled parts too quickly, without permission. And then clients backlash, the protectors punish them for that, and then the therapist thinks, oh, this client is sicker than I thought. So there are lots of people combining IFS and EMDR now, partly for that reason, for other reasons. I think it's a great technique. I don't happen to need it, but I think it can be useful that way. But anyway, that's my critique.